Dust still hung like smoke over dry Mercy when thunder rolled away and the saloon lamps flickered. The wind hissed through warped boards as Ethan Cole pushed open the batwings, boots leaving wet prints. Lydia Hart said, "That storm was wrong." Ethan scanned the room as chairs creaked and cards paused mid-air. Jonah Reed said, "Listen." A single hoofbeat clanged on the street, then the church bell tolled once without a hand on the rope. Sheriff Malvern stepped from shadow, smiling thin as wire. Malvern said, "Evening, folks." The door crashed, and a figure staggered in, red from throat to belt, eyes wide. Caleb Voss said, "They're walkin'." The room froze, like frost on iron. May Abbott rose from a corner table, voice low. "May," said the Deadlands woke. Silas Pike leaned on the bar and laughed without humor. Silas said, "Tales for children." The bell tolled again, closer this time, though no wind moved the rope. Ethan said, "What did you see, Caleb?" Caleb breathed like a broken bellows. Caleb said, graves yawning, boots on sand, faces like chalk under moon. The storm gutted the lamps to blue. Lydia said, "What did we disturb?" The floor trembled, and along the street, shutters slammed in a ripple. Malvern said, "No cause for panic." The piano answered with a dead note. Ethan said, "The past just knocked." The saloon shut its breath while Caleb's words pooled on the floor like spilled ink. Ethan steadied him and caught the stink of grave mud under rain. Caleb said, "Mounds split, crosses toppled, iron nails bent like grass." Lydia fetched a cloth and her hands shook despite her calm face. Malvern said, "Storm tricks." May frowned at the bell's echo, counting gaps like a code. Jonah said, "I heard boots, not thunder." Silas dragged a glass across wet rings and watched Ethan like a cat. Caleb said, "They were the old names, the ones the town buried twice." The lamps hissed and the room felt smaller, as if the walls leaned in to listen. Ethan said, "Where?" Caleb blinked grit from his lashes. Caleb said, "The Deadlands rim west of the dry wash." Outside, wind rattled a lonely sign. Lydia said, "No one goes there after sundown." Malvern said, "I will ride at dawn with deputies." May said, "Dawn will be too late." The piano gave that dead note again. Ethan said, "Then we move now." They crossed the boardwalk into a street that smelled of wet rope and fear. Lanterns swung like tired moons under awnings. Lydia said, "Take the north alley and avoid the ridge." Ethan nodded and checked the cylinder by feel. Jonah said, "If we see one, do we shoot?" May said, "Lead stops men, not legends." Malvern whistled, and two deputies emerged with blank faces. Malvern said, "No one leaves town limits without me." Silas drifted behind with a lazy gait and a knife smile. Caleb leaned on a hitchpost, breath ragged. Caleb said, "They stared through me as if the living were fog." The church bell kept quiet now, which felt worse. Lydia said, "We keep close and we keep eyes high." Wind shoved a curtain of grit down the road, then cleared it to silver. Ethan said, "West to the wash, then cut south." Jonah swallowed and nodded, jaw set. May touched the cross at her neck and then let it fall. The town watched from shutter cracks, silent as graves. They reached the edge where the town's last fence bowed to open sand. Beyond lay the wash, a pale scar under cloud break. Jonah said, "Tracks." The prints were old, then new, then impossible, total to heal against sense. May said they marched back to their own markers. Lydia knelt and brushed grit from an iron nail that curled like a worm. Lydia said, "Someone dug and hammered, then fled." Malvern said, "Or staged a fright." Ethan listened, counting the heartbeats between breaths, and heard a soft clicking like spurs on bone. Caleb said, "Hear that?" Wind carried the faint jingle of tack with no horse. Silas said, "If we meet them, speak their names and see who flinches." Ethan said, "We do not taunt the dead." The moon slid from a cloud and the wash flashed silver. Lydia said, "We are close." Jonah lifted his lantern, and the flame leaned as if pointing the way. May said, "Keep your feet where the sand looks dull." The Deadlands opened like a mouth, black messes ringed the flats, and the air tasted of old coins. Jonah said, "Why is it colder here?" Breath fogged in a line as if the land exhaled. May said, "Ground remembers." Lydia pointed to a row of low mounds pressed with sun-cracked boards. Lydia said, "Markers from the hanging year." Malvern said, "Those men earned their dirt." Caleb sagged against a post and stared at a name burned into wood. Caleb said, "I saw this one stand." A distant whistle rose, thin and cruel, like wire pulled taut. Ethan said, "Guns stay low, unless we see hands." The whistle stopped as if pinched. A hat rolled slowly across the flats and settled brim up. Jonah said, "No wind?" The sand around the mound sank a finger's width and held the shape. May said, "They are deciding if we belong." Lydia's fingers tightened on the lantern bail. Ethan said, "Then we speak plain to the dark." The last cloud passed the moon, and the mounds seemed to breathe. Dawn found the Deadlands glazed with frost that had no right to exist. Ethan paced the mounds and counted breaths like prayer. Lydia said, "Names matter." She traced letters with a lantern soot smear. Malvern said, "We mark and burn if needed." May shook her head and watched the light slide off sand. Jonah said, "I hear metal under us." Caleb stared at the hat that never moved since night. Caleb said, "They listened when we spoke plain." Silas whistled a tune that curled like smoke. Silas said, "Ghosts love an audience." A windless hush pressed on eardrums and made words feel heavy. Lydia said, "If someone pried these graves, who paid for it?" Malvern's deputies shifted and avoided the markers. Malvern said, "Stop spooking boys with riddles." May knelt and set 3 iron nails in a neat row. May said, "Offer answers, not fire." Ethan studied the wash line where hoofless prints overlapped. Ethan said, "We follow the tracks back to whoever stirred them." The sun climbed and gave no warmth. The mounds did not cast shadows. They traced the prints to the dry wash where shale sang under boots. Lydia said, "2 sets living, many not." She pointed to scuffs that began and ended like skipped time. Jonah said, "Could be boards on feet." May said, "Could be nothing that needs feet." Malvern walked ahead and pretended not to hear. Malvern said, "We find tools, we find hands." Caleb moved slower and touched his side. Caleb said, "There was a lantern line out here last night." Silas flicked a glance at Lydia's satchel. Silas said, "What do you carry that hums?" Lydia did not answer and tightened the strap. "What?" Ethan listened for the clicking he feared. Ethan said, "Spread 3 paces, talk soft." The wash narrowed, and the air cooled as if stepping into a cellar. Jonah said, "If this turns bad, I will not run." May smiled like winter sun. May said, "Stand smart, not brave." A tin can winked from the bank, tied to a string that vanished in gravel. Ethan said, "Trip line." The string led to a pit where boards sagged like bad teeth. Ethan eased his weight and felt the ground complain. Lydia said, "Hold." She crouched and brushed sand from a hinge. Jonah said, "Someone buried a door." May traced a circle in dust around the hinge and whispered a line older than town. Malvern said, "Lift it." Caleb gripped the board and waited for Ethan's nod. Caleb said, "On 3. Silas smiled as if expecting theater. Silas said, 1, 2, 3 suits me." They heaved, and a breath of cellar air rolled up cold and sweet with lamp oil. Lydia said, "Someone kept store down there." A ladder slanted into gray. Ethan said, "We do not all go." Malvern said, "I will choose." Jonah stepped forward, jaw hard. Jonah said, "I will see it through." May touched his sleeve and let go. May, said down and back, count 50 I. The earth around the pit trembled once, gentle as a warning. Ethan said, make it quick. Jonah climbed into air that smelled of lamp oil and rope. His lantern swung and drew bars of light on casks and crates. Jonah said, guns, tack, costumes. He held up a faded bandana marked with a skull brand. Lydia called down that it matched a trial ledger drawing. Lydia said, they kept relics to wear as masks. Ethan counted under his breath and listened for breath that was not Jonah's. Malvern said, bring the box with the stamp. Boards creaked like slow speech under Jonah's boots. Jonah said, there is a book. He opened it and saw names with dates scoured by a knife tip. May said, do not read them aloud. Caleb stared into the pit as if it could stare back. Caleb said, they dress the living as the dead. Silas picked a small locket from a shelf and pocketed it with a careless flick. Silas said, souvenir. The lantern sputtered and almost died, then flared. Jonah said, coming up. The tremor returned, not gentle this time. Sand slid toward the pit in a slow river. Ethan braced the hatch frame and reached down. Ethan said, climb. Jonah surged up the ladder with the ledger under his coat. The wash floor rippled as if something breathed below. Lydia said, back from the edge. Malvern hauled the crate out and nearly lost it as the ladder kicked. Malvern said, move. May scattered the 3 nails she had saved, and the slide slowed a heartbeat. May said, names hold. Caleb grabbed Jonah's belt and hauled him free. Caleb said, got you. Silas stepped back and watched the surface settle like a calm lie. Silas said, door shut itself. Me. The hatch coughed dust and laid flat, perfect as before. Jonah opened the ledger to a torn page with a sketch of a bell rope and a list of favors owed. Jonah said, they paid the living to ring the dead awake. Lydia closed the book with her palm and flinched as if stung. Lydia said, someone in town still takes payment. The sun felt colder than night. By noon, the town square carried whispers heavier than sermons. Jonah spread the ledger on a barrel and pointed at names gouged half away. Jonah said, these are not ghosts' words, they're contracts. Lydia leaned in close, eyes narrowing on the bell symbol scrawled at margin. Lydia said, whoever kept this book traded lives for silence. Malvern's jaw tightened as deputies shifted uneasily. Malvern said, ledger proves nothing without witnesses. May tapped the page where dates matched old gallows hangings. Hello? May said, these are witnesses that do not need tongues. Caleb swallowed hard, remembering the bell swing without a rope. Caleb said, if townsfolk are in it, we'll be bled inside our own walls. Silas chuckled low, lips curling sharp. Silas said, deals keep towns breathing, even when dead men walk. Ethan studied the square where shutters closed faster than eyes. Ethan said, someone here is still on their payroll. A gust turned the ledger page itself. Lydia said, they want it read. The townspeople circled, faces tight with fear and guilt. Lydia raised her voice so shutters could not smother it. Lydia said, the bell rope sketch marks accomplices. Malvern snapped, eyes like steel. Malvern said, careful heart. May faced the crowd without blinking. May said, if you took coin, say it now before the earth forces it out. Jonah held up the locket Silas had pocketed earlier. Jonah said, whose is this? Silas sneered, shoulders loose, but Ethan's gaze held him firm. Silas said, trinkets wash up everywhere. Caleb shook his head, voice raw. Caleb said, I saw one wearing that chain on trial day. Murmurs rose, boots scuffed dirt like restless cattle. Ethan said, fear will not hide names. A boy in the crowd spat and ran, vanishing into alleys. Lydia said that one knew. Malvern ordered deputies to chase, but they hesitated, eyes wide. The bell gave a hollow thrum. The wind was still. Jonah whispered, They already know who stayed silent. The boy's scream cut through alleys before his body was seen. Ethan sprinted, Jonah close behind, boots slapping wood. They found the lad collapsed by the well, eyes open and lips pale blue. Lydia knelt and checked his throat. Lydia said, "No wound, no struggle." May whispered a prayer as shadows gathered unnaturally tight around the body. Malvern cursed under breath. Malvern said, "This will split the town." Caleb trembled, backing from the well rope that swayed with no hand. Caleb said, "They touched him." Silas crouched and flicked dust from the boy's sleeve, smirking. Silas said, "Lesson learned for talkers." Ethan seized Silas by collar but stopped short, rage chained by reason. Ethan said, "This is not a game." Jonah looked at the well water, surface trembling though no pebble fell. Jonah said, "It's coming from below." Lydia pulled him back. Lydia said, "Not here, not now." The bell tolled once, heavy and near. Night dragged early, clouds blanketing stars. Torches lit the boardwalks, each flame guttering. Lydia said, "The bell pulls life as toll." Ethan's hand brushed revolver grip, restless. Jonah said, "We burn the rope." May shook her head, eyes grave. May said, "Burn rope, bell finds another cord." Malvern barked orders to deputies, who glanced to shadows instead of him. Malvern said, "Patrol in pairs, no one alone." Caleb flinched at echoing hoofbeats where no horse appeared. Caleb said, "They circle us now." Silas leaned at the post with careless ease. Silas said, "Better to bargain than bleed." Ethan faced him cold. Ethan said, "You speak like you know their price." Silas grinned and tapped his chest. Silas said, "Maybe, I already paid mine." The torches hissed out, one by one. Jonah lifted his lantern, flames struggling. Jonah said, "It's starting." The wind smelled of rust and grave clay. The wind rose like a howl, dragging grit through teeth. Figures formed at street's edge, outlines first, then bone-white faces beneath outlaw hats. Jonah gasped, breath steaming. Jonah said, "They walk." Ethan lifted his gun, eyes fixed. Ethan said, "Hold till they strike." Lydia's lantern shook in her grasp. Lydia said, "They look whole until you blink." May's prayer deepened, voice steady against the roar. May said, "Steel and faith together." Malvern rallied his deputies, though their knees trembled. Malvern said, "Front line with me." Caleb whispered names he read in the ledger. Caleb said, "I see them all." Silas only smiled, stepping half into shadow. Silas said, "The show begins." The first outlaw shade lifted a revolver of rust and smoke, barrel pointed steady. Ethan steadied his breath. Ethan said, "Now." The night cracked with fire and cries. Gunfire shredded the night and then died, leaving smoke that tasted of pennies. Ethan counted survivors and saw fear settle like ash. Jonah said, "Rounds passed through some like fog." Lydia steadied her lantern and watched the street breathe. Lydia said, "They test our names, not our bullets." May gathered her nails and closed her eyes. May said, "Truth binds better than iron." Malvern barked orders that carried less weight than the bell. Malvern said, "Barricade the church and hold." Caleb pointed at prints that marched toward town hall. Caleb said, "The living led them here." Silas drifted beside the paling lamp glow and smiled. Silas said, "Someone paid the toll again." Ethan felt the ledger heavy in his coat like a hot coal. Ethan said, "We go where coin meets rope." The wind answered by lifting dust in a circle around their boots. Lydia said, "Then we start at town hall vault." The bell stayed silent, which made it worse. Town hall groaned as if it remembered every oath sworn inside. Lydia pressed the vault door and felt a throb like a pulse. Lydia said, "There's a hum under the hinges." Malvern shoved past and rattled the lock. Malvern said, "Keys are mine." Ethan watched his hands shake just enough to betray him. Ethan said, "Open it slow." Jonah checked the windows where frost flowered from nowhere. Jonah said, "They are outside and listening." May placed a nail at each corner of the lintel. May said, "We name what we find." Caleb held a lamp high and found a wire that ran under the floorboards. Caleb said, "Trip another bell, and we are done." Silas laughed low like a secret. Silas said, "No traps and a fair bargain." The tumblers rolled like distant thunder, and the doors sighed inward. Lydia said, "Breathe with it." Paper smell and coin stink met them like old sins. Inside lay ledgers bound in cracked leather and bags stamped with the bell. Lydia opened one to a page of initials paired with dates. Lydia said, "Same hand as the cellar book." Jonah ran a finger down a column that bit like ice. Jonah said, "Payments align with hangings and storms." May breathed out slow and centered herself. May said, "Read softly, or not at all." Malvern snatched a ledger and flipped past entries he knew too well. Malvern said, "This is municipal tribute, nothing more." Caleb found a page marked by a black thread. Caleb said, "Here is a list of town officers and favors." Ethan saw the initials MM repeat like a drumbeat. Ethan said, "Explain those marks." Silas leaned on the vault jamb and whistled a gallows tune. Silas said, "Looks like leadership kept the rope oiled." The bell outside tolled twice, though no cord moved. Lydia whispered a name and paled. Lydia said, "The signer matches Malvern's seal." Silence cracked as Malvern's badge turned in his palm like a coin. Malvern said, "I kept this town alive when courts failed." His voice skidded between pride and plea. Lydia said, "You rented the dead to police the living." Jonah stepped closer, eyes bright with fury and fear. Jonah said, "You paid to ring that bell." May lifted a hand, not to shield him, but to measure truth. May said, "Confession changes wines." Caleb stared at the stamp burnished by many fingers. Caleb said, "How many bought safety while others swung?" Silas clapped once, softly, enjoying the sting. Silas said, "Power loves a toll road." Ethan drew a breath that felt like iron. Ethan said, "You will answer for every name." Malvern's shoulders sank, then squared. Malvern said, "You want the rope cut, you face what it keeps away." Outside, the night thickened like a tide rolling in. A shout from the square cut their argument short. They rushed out to find townsfolk gathered around the bell, eyes wide and unblinking. Lydia said no one breathed the names. The rope hung slack, yet the bell trembled. Jonah said, "They called themselves." May stepped forward and set a nail at the base of the frame. May said, "Stand in a circle and hold fast." Caleb pointed at a figure forming by the gallows post. "Go," Caleb said. That face was on the wanted bills. The shade lifted, a warrant burned into its palm. Silas smiled like he recognized an old partner. Silas said, "We meet again." Ethan raised his voice over the rising hum. Ethan said, "We speak the truth of the hangings, all of it." Malvern looked at the crowd and dropped his badge in the dust. Malvern said, "I will answer first." The bell stilled, waiting like a judge. The Deadlands swallowed them as night bled into gray dawn, Messus looming like broken teeth. Ethan led with steady boots, each step heavy as iron. Lydia said, "The air here hums, hear it." Jonah's lantern sputtered, though oil was full. Jonah said, "Light fights to stay alive." May walked firm, prayer whispering from her lips. "May," said faith, "steadies earth underfoot." Malvern trailed, shoulders bowed, but eyes sharp. Malvern said, "I will not run from what I paid." Caleb gripped his side and looked west, where mounds stretched endless. Caleb said, "They rise closer to town each night." Silas strolled, hat tipped low, grin shadowed. Silas said, "We walk into their courtroom now." The wind bent in a circle, driving grit upward like smoke. Ethan said, "We keep together. No one strays." The Deadlands answered with a whistle not made by lips, a sound of rope stretching. Lydia said, "The gallows sing." They reached a hollow marked with broken timbers, remnants of an old gallows. Jonah said, "This is where they hung the six." His voice cracked under weight of memory he never lived. Lydia touched the wood scarred by iron hooks. Lydia said, "It remembers screams." May set a nail into the earth, eyes closed. "Nay," said Mark, "this place against trespass." Malvern stared at the timbers and clenched fists until knuckles whitened. Malvern said, "I signed the warrants, every one." Caleb shivered, seeing shadows stretch unnaturally long. Caleb said, "I see them swinging." Silas whistled the tune of a rope sway. Silas said, "Justice never dies easy." Ethan steadied his revolver at his thigh but did not draw. Ethan said, "If they rise, we face them head on." Wind dragged dust around the timbers in slow circles. Jonah whispered, "They are already here." The ground trembled and split where gallows posts once stood. And from sand rose outlines of men, faces chalk white, eyes void. Jonah stepped back, voice breaking. Jonah said, "The six stand." Lydia gripped his arm. Lydia said, "Do not speak their names." May's voice grew louder, prayer against the moan of earth. May said, "Light binds darkness." Malvern froze, gaze locked on one figure. Malvern said, "I sentenced you myself." Caleb staggered, whispering fragments from the ledger. Caleb said, "Marks, dates, all true." Silas stepped forward and tipped his hat mockingly. Silas said, "Even death tips its brim to old friends." Ethan lifted his gun but hesitated. Ethan said, "We need truth, not lead." The shades raised rope-burned hands, palms outward, as if demanding reckoning. Wind howled, sand spiraling upward into a storm. Lydia shouted, "Hold fast." Storm swallowed sound, leaving only rope creak and heartbeats. The six stepped forward, chains dragging like dragged bones. Malvern fell to knees, breath ragged. Malvern said, "I did what I thought kept order." One shade lifted its palm branded with his seal. Lydia said, "Confess it all, or they will never rest." Jonah clenched fists, jaw set. Jonah said, "Tell the truth, Sheriff." May's prayer reached steady rhythm, each word striking like hammer on anvil. Caleb covered ears but still heard whispers claw his mind. Caleb said, "They speak inside my skull." Silas laughed softly, grin wide. Silas said, "The jury's out, Ethan." Ethan raised his voice to drown the whispers. Ethan said, "We break this cycle tonight." The storm's eye opened above, moon shining blood red through grit. The six halted, waiting. Malvern raised his head and cast his badge into the dust. Malvern said, "I fed the rope to keep my crown." The six hissed like wind over graves. Lydia lifted the ledger high. Lydia said, "No more names added." Jonah struck a match and lit the page edges. Jonah said, "End their contract." Flames licked words, curling them into smoke that carried on the gale. May lifted her last nail and drove it into earth with fierce cry. May said, "By truth and by light, rest now." Caleb shouted, voice breaking. Caleb said, "Take me if you must, but leave the town." Silas spread arms, as if welcoming them. Silas said, "We all owe our dues." Ethan fired once into the sky, a crack like judgment. Ethan said, "This ends with us." The storm broke, sand collapsing into silence. The six faded like ash scattered. The bell did not toll. Morning came thin and colorless, as if the Deadlands had drunk the sun. The square smelled of cold ash and wet rope. Lydia said, "The six faded, but the debt remains." Ethan scanned rooftops where crows refused to land. Ethan said, something still holds the bell to us. Jonah turned the charred ledger remnant and found a watermark. Jonah said, there is a second book. May traced the watermark, eyes narrowing. May, said bellmaker's seal beneath the church. Malvern stood apart with dust on his knees and shame on his face. Malvern said, I hid a fund there for lean years. Caleb looked toward the steeple and shivered despite sun. Caleb said, it watches. Silas leaned in the doorway of the assay office, smile easy as a lie. Silas said, basements keep the town upright. The air hummed low, like iron singing. Lydia said, we ended at the root. Ethan nodded once, and the town held its breath. They crossed the nave where pews creaked like old bones. A trapdoor waited under the bell rope shadow. Lydia said, the seal will be below. Malvern unlocked it with a key worn smooth by guilt. Malvern said, I kept more than money down there. Jonah lowered a lantern, and the light fell into stone. Jonah said, stairs spiral to a foundry pit. May placed nails across the threshold in a quiet cross. May said, we go in truth or not at all. Caleb swallowed and nodded to Ethan. Caleb said, I will take rear. Silas drifted last, hand in vest, eyes bright with private plans. Silas said, foundry heat remembers old shapes. The air grew warmer with each step, carrying the taste of rust and coal. Lydia said, hear that throb. A pulse rose through stone, as if the bell had a heart. The chamber opened into a forge, gone cold but not dead. Molds lay stacked beside slag heaps, and a half-cast clapper rested on chains. Lydia said they poured judgment here. Jonah found a small iron book, hinged and locked. Jonah said, the second ledger. Malvern reached and then stopped, fear pinning his wrist. Malvern said, I never touched that one. Silas stepped between them, knife gleaming like a wink. Silas said, I kept that account for men who needed ghosts. Ethan drew, barrel steady on his grin. Ethan said, drop it. Silas laughed and looped a wire over the clapper. Silas said, one tug and every debt wakes hungry. Caleb lunged and knocked his wrist aside, wire hissing on stone. Caleb said, not today. May's prayer rose, a hammer beat in the heat. Nay, said light over iron. The chamber trembled, as if the bell dreamed of ringing. Silas feinted left and snapped the wire tight. The clapper swung an inch and the air howled. Lydia said, stop him. Ethan fired, shattering the hook above the chain. The clapper dropped and jerked, missing stone by a hand. Jonah rushed the iron book toward May. Jonah said, open it. May pressed a nail into the lock and whispered an older key. May said, name unbinds, name. Malvern surged past fear and grabbed Silas around the waist. Malvern said, no more tolls. Silas twisted, blade flashing, and Malvern grunted as blood darkened his shirt. Caleb caught the wire and wrapped it to a post with burning palms. Caleb said, hold. Lydia snapped the iron book open, and pages of etched names reflected firelight. Lydia said, speak them to rest. The chamber's pulse stuttered, waiting for truth. Lydia read the etched names, voice steady as a bell before the strike. Lydia said, return to soil and sleep. Each name loosened the heat until breath came easy. May pressed a nail on the last line, and the iron book sighed. May said closed. Malvern staggered and slid to the wall, color draining. Malvern said, I will carry what remains. Silas tore free and reached for the wire again. Silas said, debts never die. Ethan drove his shoulder into him and sent him sprawling. Ethan said, yours can. Jonah and Caleb toppled the clapper cradle, metal thundering into the slag pit. Jonah said no more ringing. The chamber fell quiet, except for Malvern's rough breath. Caleb knelt, hands shaking. Caleb said, hold fast. Lydia met Malvern's gaze and saw a choice made. Lydia said, We end it above. The bell's echo faded like a tide, leaving bones bare. Dawn lit the church steeple with pale fire, and the bell hung silent, rope frayed to threads. Ethan stood in the square, gun at his side, but eyes on the sky. Ethan said, "It's done, but never clean." Lydia held the iron ledger closed against her chest. Lydia said, "The town will choose its truth now." Jonah stared at his soot-blackened hands. Jonah said, "I saw them fade, but I still hear boots." May gathered the last 3 nails into her palm. May said, "The land will always keep score." Malvern leaned weak against the wall, blood soaking his shirt, face hollow with guilt. Malvern said, "Let the people bury me with those I failed." Caleb steadied him with silent resolve. Caleb said, "We carry you home." Silas lingered in shadow, smiling faintly. Silas said, "Ghosts die, debts daunt." The square breathed heavy with silence, broken only by crows. The townsfolk gathered, drawn by silence heavier than sermons. Faces pale, hands clutching hats, they stared at the 7 who had faced the storm. Lydia lifted her chin and spoke. Lydia said, "You all knew the bell tolled for your comfort." Murmurs rippled like dry grass catching fire. Ethan stepped forward, steady voice cutting. Ethan said, "Truth costs more than silver." Jonah dropped ash from his palms onto the dirt. Jonah said, "We burned their names so you could live." May's eyes swept the crowd with quiet weight. May said, "Take this as a warning written in dust." Malvern coughed, blood flecking his lips, and raised his hand. Malvern said, "My ledger ends with me." The crowd shifted uneasily, shame pressed into their shoulders. Caleb looked to the horizon. Caleb said, "We bury both dead and deeds today." They carried Malvern to the edge of the Deadlands, where mounds lay quiet under morning haze. Ethan bore part of his weight, silent and grim. Malvern whispered, words torn like paper. Malvern said, "No badge redeems blood." Lydia placed the iron ledger on the mound's crest. Lydia said, "Here it rests with silence." Jonah knelt, pressing his hand to cracked soil. Jonah said, "Sleep without chains." May laid her nails atop the ledger, voice firm. May said, "Forgive or forget, the land will not." Caleb looked at the horizon where shadows faded. Caleb said, "They are gone for now." Silas tipped his hat with a sly nod. Silas said, "But someone will find a way to toll again." Ethan straightened, eyes sharp. Ethan said, "Then we guard what's left." The wind moved softly, as if agreeing. Back in town, the saloon stood scarred but upright. Chairs overturned, lamps cracked, yet laughter rose uneasy from corners. Jonah said, "We survive." Lydia shook her head, lantern hanging at her side. Lydia said, "We endured, not healed." May sipped stale coffee, face unreadable. May said, "Healing takes generations." Caleb cleaned his rifle in silence, eyes haunted. Caleb said, "I'll keep watch." Malvern's empty chair sat against the wall, badge resting on the table. Ethan stared at it, memory carved deep. Ethan said, "Power dies hard, but truth harder." Silas clinked a glass with sly ease. Silas said, "And lies live longest." The room fell quiet again, as if shadows listened. At dusk, Ethan stood alone at the fence line, the Deadlands stretching endless. The sky burned copper as the sun bled out. Lydia joined him, lantern glowing soft. Lydia said, "Do you believe it's over?" Ethan shook his head slowly. Ethan said, "No, but we gave them rest enough." Jonah walked up behind, rifle across shoulder. Jonah said, "And if they rise again?" May's voice carried from behind, calm as twilight. May said, "Then you answer again as you must." Caleb leaned on the fence, gaze lost to the horizon. Caleb said, "This land never forgives." Silas lingered in the last light, smirk sharp. Silas said, "And it never forgets." The wind tugged Ethan's coat, and he stared at the horizon. Ethan said, "The Deadlands are quiet tonight." Silence followed, heavy and final.